back, everyone, to the To Till or Not to Till podcast run by Agricology. We're speaking to lots of different experts and farmers across this series. Today, we have a guest that is, as everyone is, to be honest, across this series, very well versed in this topic. We'll be looking at sort of a bit of the decisions as to why you would look at tillage, maybe why you wouldn't, that sort of thing to cover there. We'll go into sort of our guest today's experience with himself and why he feels the way he does. So quite looking forward to that. Today's guest is Mark Measures. Mark, would you like to say hello?
Yes, good morning, everybody.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Are you doing well?
Yes, fine, thank you. With some lovely spring weather here.
Yeah, we do. It is, and I mean, even being able to say that up here in Scotland is rare for as long as we have been able to. I think we're forecast a wee bit of rain, but we won't complain a wee bit, that's for sure. Mark, these things, it's always quite good with these sort of episodes, just so someone knows who we're listening to and what their sort of story is, just to hear a bit of background about yourself, and then also, I guess, your sort of your work in soil and soil management as well.
Yes, well, I started off working with organic farming in the 1980s, early 1980s, with the Organic Research Centre, which I joined as farm manager, but very quickly got into providing advice, and we set up the Organic Advisory Service in 1985. So I have really a lifetime in advising organic farmers and advising farmers on conversion. Yeah, that's been my work. I've had a very strong link with the research world and feeding research into practice. And of course, crucially, soil is what underlies organic farming, and that link between soil and plants and animals and human health.
And before we get into the sort of technicalities of it all, Mark, I think in 1985, I'm going to take a punt that people weren't as receptive to this. Was that a more ta a challenging task at that point than it is now, or am I wrong in that?
Oh, I think in every respect, in the market is entirely undeveloped. There was no supermarket organic produce. The research world considered organic as something out there with the fairies. Farmers, by and large, hadn't recognised some of the problems that conventional farming was either facing or was about to face, and so organic farming was fairly low on their radar. So yeah, we did start at a fairly low base, albeit we had by that time developed some organic standards. So we were clear about what we were doing and what we were about.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine it was a bit of a task at sometimes. You're definitely an advocate of tillage, Mark, but with a sort of focus on, let's say, compaction, soil structure, nutrient cycling. What's the impact of tillage? I guess that's probably a three-part question, but
Well, I mean the initial driver from most farmers' point of view, most arable farmers and horticultural farmers, their first request or need from tillage is to control the weeds. This is quite a challenge, but and tillage gives them the best route to achieving that, whether that's through using a plough or some sort of regular cultivation system. So that's what they're first of all they're after. They also need to get a good seed bed, and particularly for small seeds, tillage is quite important, and even for things like potatoes, um, tillage is almost inevitable. So that was the first point.
maybe from a more focusing on nutrients in particular.
Yeah,
What's the impact there?
I think what's often not properly understood is that by tilling the soil, by introducing oxygen, air into the soil, you're actually stimulating biological activity. And that stimulation, those soil organisms, particularly the bacteria and the fungi and so on, they are using the oxygen, they're using carbon from the soil organic matter. And that process of mineralization of the soil and the organic matter is doing two things. One, it is making nutrients more available. And so obviously that's important from the point of view of the plant. So, uh, um, for example, nitrogen is made more available than it would be if you didn't till, and it enables you to use that sort of resource, that reserve of nitrogen that's been accumulated in the soil, perhaps with a green manure or perhaps with a clover ley. So that's the first thing, that tillage improves soil nutrient availability. And the second point is about soil carbon. Now, there's a lot of nonsense talked about soil carbon and accumulation of organic matter. Um, but I'll just pick up on one point, which is that the process of aerating the soil, mineralizing the soil, has an effect on an element of the soil carbon, which effectively stabilizes it. So it's producing humus. And humus is the long-term stable fraction of soil organic matter. And it's this element that is really important for long-term carbon sequestration and other benefits from soil organic matter, such as improved water holding capacity, generally create this long-term stable carbon. Now, that is distinct from some of the organic matter, which is fresher and less stable, and is often measured in some of the conventional work that's been done on no-till, where you get very high crop residues left on the surface, and they don't break down in the short term, but they are measured in the total soil carbon, but they are not part of that stable soil organic matter, which is so important for soil structure and sequestration and so on.
I think it's really easy to look at it on the when you plough, carbon's released, end of. And that's not as simple as this is.
Not at all. Not
Yeah,
at all.
absolutely. You mentioned there the obvious benefit of tillage on weeds. Mark, talk to us a wee bit about the impact of tillage on pest management as well, and maybe also sort of by extension then the overall yield performance of crops.
Well, the effect of tillage on, well, soil organisms generally, I should say, is that uh, there isn't any doubt that it does have some effect on earthworm populations, for example. So you will get an initial depletion, but they recover very quickly. With soil mycorrhiza, which of course are so important for phosphate mobilization, um, you will tend to get a slight decrease in the total population, but you won't get any decrease, and you might get a slight increase in terms of um, the range of mycorrhizal species. So there may be two effects there. Um, I think in terms of its effect on some of the pests, then cultivations might well reduce the amount of trash near the surface, and that can be an advantage in terms of subsequent crop health and minimization of disease pressure.
I think it's quite easy to look at tillage as the exact same across systems, but there's probably variation. So how does tillage's role, I guess, differ between a conventional unit and an organic unit?
Well, I think that in conventional farming, the pressure to reduce cultivations has come about partly because there is a need to address the severe depletion in soil organic matter, which has come about from the last 30, 40, 50 years of conventional practice. And the crucial point here is about their rotations. There tend to be continuous cropping rotations. And so there's a very high proportion of tillage. And because of the use of nitrogen fertilizer, for example, which tends to encourage a breakdown of soil carbon. Reducing tillage is sort of a means of them trying to address their problems in conventional farming. organic farming, it doesn't face up to this, it doesn't have to face this same problem, mainly because the rotations are completely different. So they are already typically having 30, between 30 and 60% of their rotation is in some sort of a green manure or medium-term lay. So they're not faced with the same decline in organic matter that the conventional farmers are under. So that it's a different pressure. I suppose the other elements are about cost. Certainly, conventional farmers have tried to reduce their costs by introducing no-till, albeit they've only been able to do that by routine use of Roundup. We are all familiar with some of the ecological problems of Roundup, particularly in watercourses and effect on amphibian embryology. So there are problems from no-till as practiced by conventional farmers. I would certainly argue that those problems are far greater than the supposed problems of tillage.
You mentioned earlier on, Mark, actually about the sort of the impact of tillage from an organic matter depletion perspective.
Mm,
There'll be a lot of people that will look at that and think that's what tilling does. There's
mm.
probably some truth to that, but how true is it? How in depth is that problem, and is it being made bigger than it actually is?
Well, if you look at the research that was done to the research centre in Feeble in Switzerland, where they've done 42 years of comparative rotational trials comparing conventional with organic and biodynamic, you'll see there that whilst the conventional uh, soil organic matter levels have depleted a bit over the years, the organic ones have been stable and the biodynamic ones have increased in soil organic matter. So uh, we're not faced with the same problems and the same decline in organic matter with organic rotations. We need to recognize that this drive for no-till is perhaps more relevant to conventional farmers than organic farmers, albeit there are probably things that everybody could do to deal with these problems of decline in soil organic matter. But I've been working with some farms for over 30 years now, so I've been going back to the same farms every, two or three times every year and monitoring their soil nutrient and organic matter levels. And I know that they are always maintaining their soil organic matter, and in many cases they're increasing them slightly, albeit perhaps not at the same level of increase as some enthusiasts would like to claim. So the potential for soil organic matter accumulation is fairly modest and is very dependent on soil type. So clay soils can accumulate more than sandy soils. And of course, it depends on your starting point. So if you're starting off with a farm that's been intensive conventional arable for the last 30 years, if you convert that to an organic rotation with sort of 2 or 3 years of clover lay in the rotation, then the scope for increasing soil organic matter in the short and medium term is quite significant. In the longer term, it'll reach a plateau and will become quite stable.
Which makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if you're starting something, your ability to get better in the early stages is much more than it
Indeed,
is
indeed.
20 years of intensive training or whatever. Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One thing that's always quite interesting with these, Mark, is in farming, and I assume in everything, there's always misconceptions with things. What would be the biggest misconceptions that you've came across with a particular focus on tillage? What are the things you're seeing and you're like, I don't think that's correct, or maybe it's correct, but it's been blown somewhat out of proportion.
I've alluded to this effect on soil carbon, of course, and one misconception comes about because of poor sampling methodology. If you really want to understand how the soil organic matter levels are changing over time, then you do need to be sampling to at least a half a meter depth, because some of the results of the no-till trials that I've seen suggest that there is an increase in soil organic matter, but in fact, you'll often find that it's only at the surface, sort of 5 or 6 centimeters, and actually it's a redistribution of organic matter down the profile rather than a total increase. So that's quite a big issue for me.
When we hear the word tillage or till or whatever, we jump to the plough. There's obviously more to it than just that. But
Mm.
where do you think the concepts of reduced, minimum, shallow tillage, where do you think they come in, and how important are they in this discussion? There's that middle ground between no till and plough. How important is that part?
Well, I think they are quite different, but the difference is if you're ploughing shallow, I mean, we're talking about sort of 6 inches, 15 centimeters, and possibly less than that, then you may only need to do one or two cultivations, perhaps one power harrow or one spring tine if you're on a lighter soil. So actually, the number of passes is not very great. You can get a tilth quite quickly using a plow. There are different approaches. You can have multiple passes with various cultivators, and there have been one or two very successful exponents of that. And Richard Gantlett at Yatesbury is a very good example, where he's perhaps going through 3 or 4 times with different cultivators, albeit he's not using a plough, so he's not inverting the soil. And there may be some advantages in that. You're not burying the soil organisms at a depth at which they're not well suited for example. You're leaving some of the sort of the turf or the ley that you're incorporating. You're keeping it nearer the surface, and so there could be advantages in that. But so the number of passes might be greater, but the actually reduction in energy use may not be very different. We have done some work at the Organic Research Centre on a tool called the Ecodyne, which was developed by Frederick Wentz in Germany, which is almost a single pass cultivator with a drill on the back. But it's been interesting that although total energy, total fuel use has been much less, weed levels have been higher, and the soil structure has not been as good as if you plough. And one of the problems that on some soil types is that that sort of uh, passing with that sort of cultivator can actually cause some collapse in the soil structure at the surface. And then you get capping of the soil and poor aeration. And we've found certainly on some of our silty clay soils that the Ecodyne has actually resulted in a significant yield drop, albeit the energy use was less. So it's perhaps there's a horses for courses. I mean, maybe on some soils it'll work really well, but we shouldn't make generalizations about these tools having a universal application.
I think that's the thing, and it's became somewhat of a theme of this series is, we have half an hour, however long to sit down and have a chat. It's hard to condense what for you has been 40 years experience in this world, Mark, into that very brief period. And it's hard to really bring in that concept of Gabe Brown's of context into this. It's really difficult because you're trying to sort of get somewhat of a blanket answer because we don't
No, there are
know.
there are no blanket answers or blueprints. I mean, this is the thing. You have to go back to some basic principles, and soil is fundamental to that. That's for sure.
When you're talking about those multi passes, 4 and 5 passes there, Mark, is that causing any issues with compaction?
No, the compaction really is about using the right tools, the right sort of tractor size, in the right conditions. I really only see compaction where things have been done wrong or done badly, or crops been harvested in poor conditions. And we do have very high biological activity in organic soils, and the earthworm populations are huge. They're addressing some of these soil compaction problems.
How much of a difference are you seeing in particular there, just as an example in earthworm populations?
Well, I haven't got numbers in my head, but I did a presentation at the Oxford Real Farming Conference with Tolly Tolhurst recently, and he has been monitoring earthworm populations, and they are just enormous, and that's in a ploughed intensive horticultural situation.
I am. On in another world away from from this series, I've interviewed well in excess of 300, probably 350 people. And when this discussion comes up, we talk about various things, certainly not as in depth as we have today, but we sort of touch on it, and it's fun to pick up on folks' opinions. And one of the things that comes up is there seems to be somewhat of a belief that maybe not zero, but certainly min to zero till is almost the holy grail of organic. Now, there's a lot of people that disagree with that, and there's a lot of people that agree with that. Where do you sit in that?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a false understanding. It's false in terms of the importance of tillage for the reasons I said about seedbed, weed control, nutrient supply, and I think that it's emanated from pressure coming from the conventional, or perhaps the regen world. Um, I think it's also come to some extent from the United States, particularly the work at Rodale, where they've been quite successful in developing a system based on no-till, using a crimper roller in a green manure and then direct drilling a crop into that. And in their climatic conditions, their soil conditions, it is working. But there's nobody in the UK who's made a no-till organic system work year on year. It's partly our climate, it's the competition from weeds, it's competition from residual green manures or whatever. Um, and from a practical point of view, it's just not working. And I've tried this with working with farmers over 30 years, and indeed I've been experimenting in with a project I work with in Argentina, and again we haven't managed to get reasonable yields from using these sorts of no-till approaches in an organic regime. It's not to say that some people can't make it work in some circumstances. And it might be, for example, particularly important if you're faced with severe droughts. So if you're in a particularly droughty area, then focusing on a no-till approach might have some scope. It's just I haven't made it work.
I think you said something there that sprung something into my mind, and it's maybe just because it's my thing. I come from a agricultural education background. Mark, I worked as a lecturer, not in this topic, it must be said, and I'm sure you're quite aware, given my line of questioning. There's one thing that's sort of jumping out, and just as you're saying it there, it's really become quite obvious. Is we were teaching agriculture across the board, and when you look at the arable side, you were teaching conventional and organic would come in and regenerative would come in, but it's not part of the narrative. It's almost like that extra bit you teach on the end, and that probably needs to shift. And I think there is a shift in that. But do you think education and maybe even sort of extension services have got a bit of a role to play in this that they're not playing, or do you think we're in a good spot in that regard?
Absolutely. The lessons that we've learned with organic farming are widely applicable. The use of lays in an arable rotation, for example, the use of clover as the primary source of nitrogen, the use of cover crops to ensure that the ground is covered 12 months of the year. This sort of whole idea about fertility building, um, and recognizing how best to manage soils from the point of view of eliminating pesticides and herbicides. These are all absolutely crucial lessons, and they should be the starting point for research and for education.
Throughout this series, we've come up with we've spoke about various things, with various people. But one thing that does keep coming up, and I think it is important to mention, is it's hard to be, and I hate the word green as a complete whatever blanket term for everything, but the term of it's hard to be green when you're in the red. So from a financial perspective, does is is tillage in a better position to support the economics of a farm? Is it easier to go down the no-till route because there's less inputs? What sort of where does it stand from a financial perspective? There's so much to that question, I understand.
Uh, Well, yeah, and it depends whether you have an organic or a conventional perspective, of course.
Say both. I'd be quite interested to hear your thoughts on both.
Well, if I mean, from a conventional point of view, reduced tillage seems to have some real financial advantages. In terms of no-till, I mean, first of all, just recognize that there are very few farmers. I mean, maybe less than 10% of arable farming in the UK is zero tillage, despite all the noise. I guess that's a reflection on the fact that there are some problems with no-till, including soil structural problems. Um, and weed problems, of course. We increasingly see problems of weeds and in conventional farming, whether it's black grass as a result of one system or another. There are costs and benefits to no tillage or uh, minimal tillage in conventional farming. Um, but with organic farming, still a system with a plow, a shallow plow, and I should emphasize, we are talking about shallow plowing here and possibly the use of specialist equipment to enable us to do that. It's not overwhelmingly expensive, and although there may be some fuel savings to be made from doing the sort of lower tillage operation in an organic system, the financial advantages are not very great from having a sort of minimal, shallow, non-inversion tillage system, shall I call it, a non-inversion tillage system compared with a plough cultivation system.
It's quite interesting listening to just you talk through the various things we sort of touched on there, Mark, and just listening to what you're saying. When we when we consider tillage, and this isn't when I say we, I don't mean the likes of yourself who are actively involved in this world and researching into it. I mean in general, when a farmer's looking at this discussion, are we maybe guilty of almost siloing it purely into agronomy without considering, ecology, without considering biodiversity, without considering um, other things we should be looking at, and we just focus purely on that. What fertilizer, what chemical are we using, and what are we now not going to need to use if we till in this way? Would that be a fair way to look at it, or?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, the decision as to whether to till or not, but for many people, is a rather simplistic decision. I think it has been driven by some of these, I think, over-optimistic claims about soil and organic matter accumulation, by the fact that conventional farming has been driven down a very intensive sort of system with very poor rotations. I shouldn't say monocrop, but certainly poor rotations, and so they have been driven down this route without being able to take proper consideration about the wider effect on soil life, particularly, um, and in terms of making best use of the nutrients that we have available to us. I was struck the other day that there's a farmer who was Soil Farmer of the Year on some very heavy Essex clay soils. Who, when I visited him sort of 5 years ago, as a part of, I did a Churchill study tour on soil management, and I went to see him, and at that time he'd still had 20 years of no till. What he found was that actually his soil structure uh, wasn't so good, and that he was accumulating lots of rather fresh, raw organic matter on the surface, which was reducing seed germination. And it was a resource that actually he wasn't using. If he'd incorporated that organic matter that was left over on the surface into the soil, he would have enhanced his nutrient availability and enabled him to reduce his conventional fertilizer inputs. He was reported in the Farmers Weekly last month as having introduced a plough. People are learning by experience. He was a pioneer in what he did, but actually, some level of cultivation probably still has a really important role for him because he can see some other advantages in it.
How much of a difference do you see between the likes of a Lincolnshire arable farm compared to, I'm just giving two examples here that are springing to mind that are relatively different. Wet north of England, maybe south of Scotland, dairy type unit that's still growing arable ground. What is the difference in role? We've sort of talked to the difference in role between organic and conventional, but just that sort of system, more focusing on the context of the climate, the context of rainfall, that sort of thing. What major differences are you seeing in these completely differing systems from a requirement of tillage perspective?
I suppose an extreme comparison. I've worked with a couple of farms for 20 or 30 years. One is on the Lincolnshire silts, growing a range of cereals and brassicas and potatoes. And there you see their challenge is that those soils difficult to get a tilth quickly. One of their challenges, which still hasn't been properly resolved, is how do you get a tilth from ploughing in February for a crop that needs to go in by the end of the month? And in reality, it needs a bit of weathering on those soils. You compare that with some sand land in North Norfolk, where the farm I've been working with has been growing carrots and onions, and they can plough one day and be drilling in the afternoon. It is very site specific. It does need different cultivation techniques. It needs different tools, um, but but they're both still relying on a plough.
You mentioned, Mark, about a poor rotation. I assume there's more levels to that than just the wrong crop. What can a poor rotation be?
The fundamental is this sort of fertility building element of a rotation. It's, typically we're used to growing 2 or 3 or 4 years of grass, clover, lays using white clover, red clover, a range of grasses, possibly introducing some herbs like chicory to help the deeper rooting. Um, so that's the basis. Getting adequate nitrogen fixation, so having sufficient legumes in the rotation, giving those legumes the best opportunity to do their job to fix the nitrogen. So that's my main point, and then making sure that there's an adequate mix of subsequent crops. I mean, avoiding more than two years of the same crop in succession, for example, growing a leguminous arable crop, peas or beans, to extend the rotation a bit, using an overwinter cover crop or green manure to stop leaching and perhaps to fix a bit more nitrogen. All these things are crucial in terms of having a decent rotation. And most of these things can be introduced into conventional farming, albeit the big challenge for everybody is how do you make any money out of grass clover lays? And we all know historically the problem that we've been up against. Currently, of course, we're in a bit of up horn and down corn scenario where we're actually making money out of sheep and cattle.
Yeah, things have somewhat flipped at the minute.
Oh
It's a
yeah, don't
strange
get
position to be in.
don't get complacent. But anyway, it is. But it's a great rebalancing, I think. And perhaps we will see a shift into better farming systems as a result of that.
As we sort of draw these episodes to a close, Mark, I've sort of tried to end on a the people we're bringing on this series, including yourself, are well versed in this topic. Almost sort of end it in a piece of advice to someone maybe listening. So, to the person who's listening that maybe is looking at either taking on a farm and looking to reduce tillage but not reduce benefits, or maybe they're looking at sort of changing their system in that direction. What would your advice to them be?
Make sure that they've got a decent rotation. Um, get rid of any equipment that is unsuitable, like a deep plow. If you're routinely plowing at 10 inches, then this is not the best thing for soil organisms, that's for sure. Absolutely, avoid all of the nastier inputs, which the synthetic fertilizers, most of the pesticides do have a negative effect on soil life. That's a problem, and you need to get to grips with that. If it's an organic system that we're trying to establish, then I think it's best done on a gradual basis, on a sort of field by field basis, rather than trying to sort of gradually eliminate the inputs across the whole farm over, say, a 5-year period, or even a crash reduction, elimination of inputs. I would prefer a more planned and considered approach.
It might be quite interesting to ask you a question based on what you've said there. You said about consider what you're putting on the ground from a chemical perspective, be that pesticide, be that fertilizer. Is there place for those inorganic products?
Given that most farming in Britain is still locked into a system which needs those inputs in order for them to be agronomically productive and financially viable, then you can't say, oh, we've got to eliminate these all overnight. What we do need to say is that many of them are shouldn't be used, and that you need to develop systems where they can be reduced or eliminated.
It's a process, isn't it? Like you said, it's a field by field thing. It's not okay, there's 10,000 hectares, let's change. Yeah, it
No,
doesn't happen overnight.
we all have to stay in business.
We do, absolutely.
We know that the organic business is as profitable as the conventional ones by and large, and we know it works agronomically, and we know that we can run successful businesses. So we should aspire to the targets which are currently being promoted for 10% organic. That's where we should be heading in the next 10 years.
Do you think that's a target we'll hit or we can hit?
Oh, it needs quite a few interventions by government, by various environmental bodies, um, and by development of the market, and probably some better development of our techniques. Then we can hit it. Yeah.
Pretty positive note to end on. It's been a pleasure having you on, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed. It's good to talk through all these issues.
And here, I'm learning a lot from doing this. It must be
I
said.
bet.
I really am. And for those of you listening, I hope you've enjoyed another episode of the Agricology To Till or Not to Till series. That's been Mark Measures. Thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you in the next one.